Edit. Who fixed all 22 planes? The CEO asked. Everyone pointed to the single dad she fired. Why would everyone point to the same person? What truth could this question be hiding? Hello and welcome. We're so glad you're here to share another unforgettable story with us. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about dignity, second chances, and quiet courage, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Thank you for your support and for being part of this wonderful community. It truly means the world to us. Before we begin, tell us in the comments. If you were the CEO, what would you do after hearing that question? Now, settle in, and let's step into the remarkable story that begins with a single question no one expected to answer. Who fixed all 22 planes? The question echoed across Hangar 3 like a warning no one wanted to answer. For a long moment, the room held its breath. Mechanics stopped typing. Supervisors lowered their clipboards. Even the steady hum of hydraulic carts seemed to fade beneath the weight of that single sentence. Victoria Hayes, the newly appointed CEO of Hayes Regional Airways, stood in the middle of the operations floor, her tailored navy suit immaculate despite the chaos surrounding her. Behind the glass walls, 22 passenger aircraft sat motionless beneath a gray morning sky, lined up along the taxiway like silent promises that could no longer be kept. Every grounded jet represented canceled flights, stranded families, missed graduations, delayed reunions, and thousands of travelers wondering why their day had suddenly come to a halt. Digital departure boards flashed one delay after another while customer service phones rang without pause. Somewhere across the terminal, a young boy hugged his backpack tighter as he stared through the windows at the motionless airplanes, unable to understand why none of them were leaving. Inside the maintenance control room, tension settled over every face. Victoria's blue eyes swept across engineers, inspectors, and maintenance supervisors. I asked a simple question, she said, her voice calm but carrying through the vast hangar. Who fixed all 22 planes? No one answered. A veteran inspector rubbed the bridge of his nose. Another technician glanced toward the floor. A maintenance planner quietly closed the laptop in front of him as though hiding from the silence itself. The question lingered. It refused to disappear. Finally, an older mechanic named Frank Nolan slowly removed his safety glasses. His hands, rough from nearly 4 decades of turning wrenches, trembled just enough to reveal what pride would never admit. He looked toward a row of empty lockers near the back wall. One locker remained closed, its nameplate still untouched. Ethan Walker. Frank swallowed before speaking. The man who fixed them, his voice cracked, was the single dad you fired yesterday. No one moved. The words settled heavier than steel. Victoria's confident posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Around her, eyes quietly shifted toward the same empty locker. Not one person argued. Not one person corrected him. The silence itself became the answer. Outside, a light rain began tapping softly against the hangar roof. A baggage tug rolled slowly past without a destination. Beyond the runway fence, the American flag fluttered in the cool morning breeze while 22 airplanes waited patiently for someone who was no longer there. Victoria stared at the untouched locker as questions she had never considered began forming in her mind. Who was Ethan Walker, really? Why had no report, no meeting, no executive briefing ever mentioned his name? And if everyone in this building knew his value, how had she become the only person who failed to see it? 8 weeks earlier, long before the grounded aircraft and unanswered questions, Ethan Walker arrived at Hayes Regional Airways every morning at exactly 5:30. The parking lot was still wrapped in darkness, and the cool air carried the familiar scent of jet fuel mixed with fresh coffee drifting from the employee break room. He always parked in the same corner beside the chain-link fence, climbed out of his 12-year-old pickup truck, and smiled as he looked at the small drawing taped to his dashboard. It was a picture his 9-year-old daughter, Lily, had colored, with bright blue crayons. Across the top she had written in careful block letters, "My daddy makes airplanes safe." Ethan folded the drawing carefully into his lunchbox before walking toward the hangar. He never hurried, and he never wasted a step. To most employees, he was simply another maintenance technician wearing a faded gray work shirt with his name stitched above the pocket. Quiet, reliable, easy to overlook. Yet every mechanic knew that if a problem refused to make sense, Ethan somehow found the answer. He never announced what he discovered. He simply fixed it, signed the paperwork, and moved on to the next task before anyone could thank him. During one early inspection, a young mechanic frowned at an engine report that refused to match the sensor readings. "I have checked this 3 times, the young man sighed. Ethan leaned over the tablet for less than a minute. "Look at the wiring harness behind panel C21, he said softly. "Sometimes vibration loosens the connector just enough to fool the computer." The mechanic blinked. "How did you know that?" Ethan smiled without looking up. "Because airplanes always tell the truth. We just have to listen." 20 minutes later, the warning disappeared exactly as Ethan predicted. No celebration followed. No applause. The young mechanic received credit for solving the issue, and Ethan quietly walked away carrying his toolbox toward another aircraft waiting on the far side of the hangar. That was how every day unfolded. He corrected maintenance records before inspectors noticed missing details. He caught worn hydraulic seals before they became expensive repairs. He stayed late to help co-workers finish inspections so they could attend birthdays, baseball games, and school concerts with their families. If someone thanked him, he simply answered, "We all get people home together." Every afternoon, exactly at 4:30, Ethan left the airport and drove across town to Lincoln Elementary School. Lily was always waiting on the front steps with a backpack nearly as big as she was. The moment she saw his truck, her face brightened. "Did the airplanes behave today?" she asked as she climbed inside. Ethan laughed. Softly. "Most of them did." She grinned. "The stubborn ones waited for you, did they not?" He nodded. "Sometimes machines just need a little patience." Lily looked out the window as they drove toward home beneath the steady path of descending aircraft. "Mom used to say you could fix anything." Ethan kept his eyes on the road, his expression gentle. "Not everything, sweetheart. Just the things people trust me to take care of." As another passenger jet crossed the evening sky, neither of them realized that quiet promise would soon be tested in a way neither father nor daughter could have imagined. The following Monday began with polished speeches, camera flashes, and promises of a new era. Employees gathered inside the headquarters auditorium where banners announced the arrival of Victoria Hayes as the new chief executive officer. She was young by executive standards, confident, highly educated, and determined to transform the regional airline into a national competitor. Investors applauded as she spoke about efficiency, innovation, and measurable performance. Charts filled the giant screen behind her, displaying numbers, projections, and ambitious growth plans. Every sentence reflected precision. Every goal sounded achievable. Yet among all the graphs and strategies, there was not a single mention of the mechanics who worked before sunrise or the inspectors whose signatures kept families safe every single day. Ethan sat quietly near the back beside Frank Nolan, listening without judgment. When the applause ended, everyone returned to work, believing little would change overnight. They were wrong. Within days, consultants filled conference rooms carrying tablets, spreadsheets, and colorful reports. Departments were reviewed one by one. Experience was measured against labor costs. Efficiency scores replaced personal recommendations. Managers were instructed to justify every position using data alone. Victoria believed organizations became stronger when every employee could be explained by a report. She respected numbers because numbers rarely argued. Unfortunately, numbers also failed to tell complete stories. During one executive meeting, the director of operations hesitated while reviewing the maintenance department. He pointed toward Ethan's personnel file. "His productivity numbers appear average," one consultant observed. "He spends too much time assisting other technicians instead of completing assigned tasks." Another executive nodded while scrolling through performance charts. "There are no innovation awards, no leadership titles, and no management responsibilities." Victoria studied the file for several seconds. "If his performance is average, why is his salary above entry level?" she asked. Silence followed. No one around the table had an answer that fit inside a spreadsheet. Finally, someone replied, "He has been here for almost 15 years. Victoria closed the folder. Longevity is not a business strategy. The decision came quietly. Human Resources prepared the paperwork before lunch. Ethan was called into a small office overlooking the maintenance hangar. The representative spoke kindly, explaining restructuring, operational efficiency, and organizational alignment. Every sentence sounded professional. Every word felt rehearsed. Ethan listened without interruption. When the explanation ended, he simply nodded. "May I finish today's inspection before I leave?" he asked. The representative looked surprised. "Technically, your access ends immediately." Ethan smiled gently. "I understand." He signed every document without complaint, folded his employee identification badge into its envelope, and thanked everyone for the opportunity to serve the company. As he walked through the hangar carrying his small toolbox, conversations slowly faded. Mechanics looked up from open engine panels. Inspectors stopped writing. A few wanted to speak, but none found the right words. Frank finally stepped forward. "This place will not be the same tomorrow," he whispered. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Take care of each other. Safe airplanes are built by good people working together." Then he walked toward the parking lot beneath the afternoon sun. Behind him, aircraft continued arriving and departing as though nothing had changed. Ahead of him waited a different life, one he accepted with quiet dignity. None of the executives watching from the office windows realized they had just allowed the most important person in their maintenance operation to drive away without ever knowing why everyone else had trusted him. The first week after Ethan left felt almost ordinary. Airplanes continued arriving on schedule, passengers filled the terminals, and executives congratulated themselves on a smooth transition. Victoria reviewed reports showing lower labor costs and improved budget projections. The numbers looked encouraging, exactly as the consultants had predicted. Yet deep inside the maintenance hangar, experienced mechanics noticed subtle changes that no spreadsheet could measure. Small questions lingered longer than they should have. Minor discrepancies remained unresolved until the next shift. Tasks that Ethan used to complete in minutes now required several meetings and multiple opinions. Nobody panicked because each issue appeared manageable on its own. A loose calibration here, an inconsistent sensor reading there. An inspection delayed until the afternoon because someone wanted a second review. Individually, none of these problems seemed serious. Together, they quietly began forming a pattern. Frank Nolan watched it unfold with growing concern. One morning, he examined a maintenance log and frowned. "Has anyone verified this pressure reading?" he asked. A younger technician looked up from his tablet. "We followed the manual exactly." Frank nodded slowly. "The manual is important. Experience is important too." The room became silent. Everyone understood what he meant without speaking the missing name aloud. Meanwhile, Victoria spent her days meeting investors, negotiating expansion opportunities, and introducing new performance systems. She believed the organization simply needed time to adjust. Whenever department heads mentioned temporary slowdowns, she encouraged patience and reminded them that change always required discipline. Her confidence never wavered because every executive summary still pointed toward long-term success. Then the first aircraft failed its final maintenance verification. The discrepancy was minor, but regulations required additional inspection before departure. 2 flights were delayed. The following morning, another aircraft required unexpected review after technicians discovered conflicting maintenance records. By the end of the week, several more jets remained parked longer than scheduled while teams searched for answers that seemed frustratingly close yet strangely out of reach. No single failure explained the growing delays. Instead, dozens of tiny uncertainties stacked together like puzzle pieces that refused to fit. Dispatchers adjusted schedules. Customer service representatives apologized to travelers. Pilots waited patiently in crew lounges while engineers repeated inspections they normally completed without hesitation. Every employee worked harder than ever, yet progress seemed slower with each passing day. Frank quietly opened old maintenance files late one evening. As he compared reports from previous years, he noticed something he had never considered before. Whenever a complicated issue appeared, another signature quietly followed somewhere deeper in the documentation. Sometimes it was attached to a revised inspection checklist. Sometimes it appeared beside an engineering note or a corrected troubleshooting sequence. The handwriting belonged to Ethan, not because he wanted recognition, but because someone had trusted him to make certain every aircraft truly met the highest safety standards before passengers ever stepped on board. Frank closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. He suddenly realized they had never depended on one dramatic act of brilliance. They had depended on thousands of invisible moments of careful judgment repeated day after day by a man who never asked anyone to notice. Outside, dawn slowly brightened the horizon beyond the runway. One after another, 22 aircraft remained parked, waiting for approvals that refused to come, while inside the executive offices, the first uneasy questions finally began replacing confidence. By sunrise the following morning, the maintenance operations center no longer sounded like the calm heartbeat of a dependable airline. Telephones rang without pause. Printers produced inspection reports faster than anyone could review them. Supervisors moved from one workstation to another carrying stacks of paperwork, while dispatch coordinators searched desperately for available aircraft that did not exist. Every conversation ended with the same frustrating conclusion. Another inspection was required. Another verification remained incomplete. Another departure would have to wait. Victoria Hayes walked into the operations room expecting updates. Instead, she found exhausted faces and unanswered questions. "How many aircraft are still waiting?" she asked. A scheduler looked up from his monitor. 22, ma'am." She frowned. "What is causing the delay?" Nobody offered a simple explanation. Every aircraft had a different maintenance note. One required additional calibration verification. Another contained inconsistent inspection history. A third showed a recurring sensor alert that disappeared whenever technicians attempted to reproduce it. None of the issues appeared dangerous, yet none could legally be ignored. Regulations demanded certainty, not assumptions. Victoria folded her arms. "Then find the pattern." Her words echoed through the room, but the pattern had already begun revealing itself. Frank Nolan gathered several senior mechanics around an old conference table covered with maintenance binders dating back years. "Forget the summaries," he said quietly. "Read every correction." Hour after hour they turned pages filled with handwritten notes, engineering comments, inspection revisions, and technical observations. At first the records appeared ordinary. Then similarities emerged. Whenever an unusual vibration appeared, one set of notes quietly explained the real cause. Whenever an electrical discrepancy confused younger technicians, another comment redirected them toward the correct diagnostic path. Whenever an inspection seemed complete, but something still felt wrong, someone had added one final recommendation that prevented a future problem. The handwriting changed from report to report, but the signature at the bottom remained remarkably consistent. Ethan Walker. Sometimes his name appeared boldly. Sometimes only his employee identification number confirmed his involvement. He had never rewritten entire procedures. He had simply corrected countless details before anyone else realized they mattered. Frank slowly removed his reading glasses. He was not fixing airplanes, he whispered. He was teaching this entire department how to think. The room fell silent. A younger engineer opened another binder from 5 years earlier, then another from 3 years earlier, then another from the previous winter. The same discovery repeated itself. Ethan had quietly become the final layer of judgment behind hundreds of successful inspections without ever requesting recognition. Victoria entered the room just as another binder landed on the table. "What have you found?" she asked. Frank gently slid the open file toward her. Every complicated case eventually reached him. Victoria scanned page after page. Every correction was precise. Every note was brief. Every recommendation focused on protecting passengers rather than proving expertise. There were no personal comments, no complaints, and no attempts to claim credit. Only careful observations written by someone who believed safety mattered more than recognition. Victoria continued turning pages until her confident expression slowly disappeared. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, she realized the reports she had trusted had measured visible productivity, but had completely overlooked invisible responsibility. The company had never depended upon one extraordinary repair. It had depended upon one extraordinarily dependable man whose greatest work was preventing problems so quietly that nobody realized he had already solved them. Victoria did not leave the conference room immediately. She remained standing beside the table, surrounded by maintenance binders that suddenly felt more valuable than every presentation she had reviewed since taking office. Outside the windows, the grounded aircraft remained perfectly still beneath a pale afternoon sky. They were no longer just delayed departures on an operations screen. They had become reminders of something she had failed to measure. "Find him," she finally said. The instruction was simple, yet no one moved at first. Frank Nolan looked at her for several seconds before quietly asking, "Do you want the technician back, or do you want the man who kept this place together?" Victoria lowered her eyes. The question carried more weight than any financial report she had ever signed. I want to speak with Ethan Walker, she answered honestly. Within an hour, supervisors began making phone calls. Human Resources searched old employment records. Former coworkers reached out to friends who had stayed in touch. A retired inspector remembered hearing that Ethan occasionally repaired family vehicles in a small independent garage on the north side of town. Another mechanic believed he had seen Ethan buying lumber at a neighborhood hardware store only a few days earlier. Every person they contacted described the same quiet character. He never talked about himself. He always stayed after everyone else left. He cared more about passengers than paychecks. If you made a mistake, he corrected it without embarrassing you. Victoria listened as one story after another painted a picture completely different from the employee profile she had reviewed weeks earlier. No performance chart had mentioned the birthdays he helped coworkers attend by finishing their inspections. No productivity report had explained why younger mechanics instinctively sought his advice before signing complicated maintenance releases. No spreadsheet recorded the confidence pilots felt whenever they saw his signature on an inspection log. Those qualities had never been entered into a database because they could not be reduced to numbers. Late that afternoon, Frank drove toward the address provided by an old friend. Victoria followed in her own vehicle, leaving behind the polished glass headquarters for neighborhoods she had never visited before. The streets grew quieter. Small brick homes lined the sidewalks. Children rode bicycles beneath tall maple trees while neighbors waved from front porches. Eventually, they reached a modest service garage with 2 open repair bays and a hand-painted wooden sign that simply read Walker Auto Service. There were no expensive advertisements. No polished showroom. Just honest work. Victoria stepped out of her car and paused. Through the open garage door, she saw Ethan kneeling beside an aging pickup truck while explaining something to a customer who smiled with obvious relief. Ethan pointed toward the worn brake components resting on a workbench. The replacement can wait another month, he said kindly. You do not need to spend money today if the part is still safe. The customer looked surprised. Most shops would have charged me anyway. Ethan shrugged with an easy smile. My daughter reminds me every day that trust is harder to repair than cars. After the customer drove away, Ethan wiped his hands with a clean shop towel and turned toward the parking lot. His expression remained calm as he recognized Frank. Then his eyes settled briefly on Victoria. There was no anger, no bitterness, only quiet curiosity. The afternoon breeze carried the distant sound of an airplane passing high above the town, and for one long moment, none of them spoke. For several quiet seconds, the only sounds inside the small garage were the ticking of a cooling engine and the distant chirping of birds outside the open service bay. Ethan folded the shop towel over his shoulder and offered the same polite smile he gave every customer. Frank, he said warmly, extending his hand. It is good to see you. Then he turned toward Victoria. Ms. Hayes. She nodded, suddenly finding it far more difficult to speak than she had expected during the drive. Boardrooms had never intimidated her. Shareholders had never shaken her confidence. Yet standing in front of a mechanic wearing grease-stained gloves somehow felt different. May we talk? She asked. Ethan glanced toward the clock hanging above the workbench. I have about 30 minutes before I pick up my daughter from school. His answer was not dismissive. It was simply honest. Please. Victoria stepped farther into the garage, while Frank quietly remained near the entrance, sensing this conversation belonged to them alone. For a moment, Victoria searched for the carefully prepared explanation she had rehearsed. None of it sounded appropriate anymore. I made a mistake, she finally admitted. The words came slowly, stripped of executive polish. I believed reports that told me what people produced. I never learned who they really were. Ethan listened without interrupting. His expression remained calm, neither satisfied nor offended. The airline needs you, Victoria continued. The maintenance team cannot move forward without your experience. I would like you to come back. Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment before placing a wrench carefully onto the workbench. Do they need me? He asked quietly. Or do they need someone to solve a problem? Victoria hesitated. She knew there was an important difference. Both, she answered truthfully. Ethan nodded once. That is more honest than most answers. Sunlight streamed through the open garage door, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Victoria looked around the modest workspace. Every tool rested neatly in its place. Family photographs hung beside inspection certificates. One picture showed Lily proudly holding a science fair ribbon while Ethan stood beside her, smiling with unmistakable pride. Another showed father and daughter sitting beneath the wing of a restored vintage airplane at a community aviation museum. Victoria realized she was seeing the part of Ethan's life no employee record had ever captured. "I cannot pretend the last few weeks never happened," Ethan said gently. "My daughter watched me pack my locker. She asked why I was leaving a place where I had so many friends." Victoria looked down. "I am sorry." Ethan believed her. He could hear it in the quiet sincerity of her voice. But forgiveness and trust were not the same journey. "Tell me something," he said. "Are the passengers safe?" Victoria answered immediately. "Yes. Every aircraft remains on the ground until every inspection is complete." Ethan released a slow breath of relief. Good. That single word surprised her more than anything else. He had not asked about salary. He had not mentioned his job title, his reputation, or the embarrassment of being dismissed. His first concern had been complete strangers sitting in airport terminals waiting to reach home safely. Victoria finally understood what every mechanic had tried to explain without words. Ethan Walker had never treated maintenance as a career. He treated it as a promise. And promises, once made, continued to matter even after someone else had broken them. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the airport before sunrise for the first time since leaving the company. He was not wearing his old employee badge because it had already been surrendered. Instead, a temporary visitor pass rested against his gray work shirt as he walked through the familiar hangar with the same quiet confidence that had never depended on a title. Conversations slowly faded as mechanics looked up from their workstations. One by one, heads turned. A young technician smiled first, then another. Frank stepped forward and simply said, "Welcome back." Ethan nodded with gratitude. "Let us get everyone home safely." There were no speeches, no celebration, only work waiting to be done. Victoria stood several feet away, watching something she had rarely seen inside an executive office. People were not responding to authority. They were responding to trust. Ethan gathered the maintenance team around a large inspection board covered with aircraft numbers and pending reports. He picked up a marker and quietly reorganized every assignment. "Do not chase every symptom," he said. "Find the first cause. The rest usually follows." He paired experienced mechanics with younger technicians, encouraging them to explain every decision instead of simply completing the task. "Knowledge shared today prevents mistakes tomorrow," he reminded them. Instead of solving every problem himself, he guided others toward the answers. The atmosphere inside the hangar slowly changed. Stress gave way to purpose. Questions became conversations. Conversations became solutions. On the first aircraft, Ethan reviewed an inspection that had delayed departure for nearly 2 days. He studied the maintenance history, listened to the engine during a routine ground test, then pointed toward a pressure sensing line hidden behind an access panel. "Check this fitting again," he said calmly. "The numbers are correct, but something about the timing is not." Minutes later, a technician discovered a tiny alignment issue that had confused multiple diagnostic systems without creating an obvious failure. The correction took less than 15 minutes. One airplane was cleared for service. Nobody cheered. They simply moved to the next aircraft. By early afternoon, the same disciplined process repeated itself across the hangar. Every inspection became an opportunity to teach rather than impress. Ethan reminded everyone never to assume, never to rush, and never to ignore the quiet feeling that something deserved one more look. Federal Aviation Administration inspectors observed the team's work from a respectful distance. One senior inspector eventually approached Frank and smiled. "Your department feels different today." Frank glanced toward Ethan, who was patiently explaining an inspection checklist to a mechanic less than half his age. "It always did," Frank replied softly. "We just forgot why." As the afternoon sun reflected across polished fuselages, aircraft after aircraft completed final verification. Dispatch screens slowly changed from delayed to ready. Pilots returned to their cockpits. Flight attendants welcomed relieved passengers aboard with warm smiles. Families waiting inside the terminal began hearing departure announcements instead of apologies. Victoria watched through the glass overlooking the ramp as the first aircraft rolled steadily toward the runway. Then another followed. Then another. The airport slowly came back to life, not because one man performed miracles, but because one humble leader reminded everyone that excellence grows where patience, responsibility, and respect work together. As the final inspection package was signed, an unexpected silence settled across the hangar. Every mechanic, every supervisor, every inspector looked toward Ethan. He simply closed the maintenance binder, smiled modestly, and returned the pin to the workbench as though he had done nothing extraordinary at all. The following Friday, every one of the 22 aircraft had safely returned to regular service. Departure boards once filled with delays now displayed destinations stretching across the country, and families once stranded were finally on their way home. Inside the headquarters auditorium, the atmosphere was far different from the confident presentation Victoria Hayes had delivered only weeks earlier. This time there were no colorful charts predicting the future. There were only employees gathered together, waiting quietly as she stepped onto the stage. She looked across the room before speaking. "Leadership is not proven by always being right," she said. "It is proven by recognizing when you have been wrong and having the courage to make it right." The room remained silent. Victoria took a slow breath. "I judged a remarkable man by numbers that never measured his character, his wisdom, or the trust he had earned. That mistake belongs to me alone." She then invited Ethan Walker to join her. He walked to the front wearing the same simple gray work shirt he had always worn, looking slightly uncomfortable with the attention. The applause began quietly from the maintenance team, then spread through the room until every employee was standing. Ethan waited patiently until the applause faded before speaking. "Thank you," he said with a humble smile. "But airplanes are never kept safe by one person. Every inspection, every repair, every checklist, and every careful decision belongs to a team that chooses responsibility over pride." His words carried more weight than any speech because everyone knew he had lived them every day. Victoria then offered him the newly created position of Director of Technical Operations, explaining that the company wanted his leadership, his knowledge, and his vision for the future. Ethan listened respectfully before shaking his head with quiet grace. "I appreciate your confidence," he replied, "but I have never wanted a bigger office. I only wanted enough time to do the work correctly and enough trust to help others learn." Instead, he accepted a new role as senior maintenance mentor, allowing him to continue working alongside mechanics while training the next generation of technicians. The decision surprised many executives, but made perfect sense to everyone inside the hangar. Over the following months, the culture of Hayes Regional Airways slowly changed. New employee evaluations included mentorship, teamwork, and professional integrity alongside measurable performance. Young mechanics were encouraged to ask questions instead of hiding mistakes. Managers spent time inside the hangars listening before making decisions. Victoria herself visited the maintenance floor every week, not to inspect numbers, but to understand the people behind them. Late one peaceful afternoon, Ethan finished his shift, placed his tools back into their cabinet, and drove to Lincoln Elementary School. Lily was already waiting by the front entrance with the same bright smile that had greeted him every afternoon. She climbed into the truck and noticed a small company pin resting on the dashboard. "Did they finally tell everyone how much you helped?" she asked. Ethan smiled as they pulled onto the quiet street. "Some people learned an important lesson," he answered gently. Lily looked through the windshield just as one of the airline's aircraft crossed the golden evening sky. "Are the passengers safe?" she asked. Ethan watched the airplane disappear into the sunset before nodding. "Yes, sweetheart, they are." Lily smiled with quiet satisfaction and reached for his hand. Neither of them said another word. Sometimes the strongest proof of dignity is not found in applause or promotions. Sometimes it is found in the peaceful silence of a father driving home, knowing he kept a promise that no job title could ever define.